The morning sun, usually a welcome beacon, splintered into 1,000 fractured reflections on the surface of Eleanor Vance's pool, each shimmer catching a sickening, oily rainbow. She stood on the edge of the patio, her bare feet growing cold. On the flagstones, a ceramic mug of lukewarm coffee forgotten in her hand. Her breath hitched. It couldn't be. Not her pool. Not the pristine sapphire rectangle she meticulously cared for, her only true luxury in a life of disciplined frugality. But it was. A thick, dark film, like spilled crude, coated the entire expanse of the water. It clung to the white skimmer, stained the ceramic tiles, and stretched in an iridescent, repulsive blanket from one end to the other. The smell hit her then. A heavy, acrid stench of engine oil, cutting through the faint scent, of chlorine that usually perfumed her backyard. It wasn't a small spill, not a leaking bottle. This was deliberate, massive, malicious. Panic, hot and sharp, clawed its way up her throat. She dropped the mug. It shattered silently on the patio, unnoticed. Her gaze, wide and disbelieving, swept across the pool, then to the high wooden fence that separated her yard from her neighbors. Brenda Jenkins. The name resonated with a dull throb in Eleanor's temples. It had to be Brenda. Who else? For years, their relationship had been a simmering pot of petty grievances. The overhanging branch from Brenda's unruly oak, the misplaced garden gnome, Brenda insisted had migrated from Eleanor's yard, the passive-aggressive notes about noise Eleanor hadn't made. It was a cold war fought with glares and muttered complaints, punctuated by the occasional verbal skirmish over a shared property line or a stray dog. But this wasn't petty. This was an act of environmental terrorism against her own backyard. Eleanor rushed to the pool's edge, leaning over, her stomach churning. The oil was thick, viscous. It didn't just sit on the surface. It seemed to swirl, hinting at depths of contamination she couldn't fathom. She dipped a finger, recoiling immediately from the greasy film. This wasn't just a mess. This was destruction. Her sanctuary, violated. Her mind raced, frantically sifting through solutions. A pool net? A towel? Absurd. This wasn't leaves or a dead frog. This was oil. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of gallons of water were now contaminated. She grabbed her phone, her fingers fumbling, and called her usual pool service. Eleanor Vance here. My pool. Something terrible has happened. Her voice trembled, cracking on the last word. There's oil in it. Like engine oil. Everywhere. A pause on the other end. Oil, ma'am? Are you sure? The young technician, Kevin, sounded incredulous. Yes, I'm sure. It's black. It smells. It's all over the surface. It looks like someone poured barrels of it in there. Okay, calm down, Ms. Vance. We'll send someone over right away. But oil. That's not typical. We might need a specialist. The word specialist hung in the air, cold and ominous. It implied a problem beyond chlorination and pH levels. It implied serious money. Within an hour, a senior technician, Mr. Henderson, arrived, his face grim as he surveyed the scene. He wore a mask over his nose and mouth, though the scent of oil still seemed to permeate the air around them. Oh my. This is significant, Ms. Vance, he said, his voice muffled by the mask. He walked slowly around the perimeter, shaking his head. This isn't something we can just filter out. The entire system is compromised. The pump, the filters, the pipes, everything that water has touched will be coated. And the water itself. We can't just drain this. This is a hazardous material spill. Eleanor felt a cold dread spread through her. Hazardous material? What are you talking about? It's just oil. Just oil, ma'am, is a serious pollutant, especially if it's motor oil, which this certainly appears to be. This isn't cooking oil, this is petroleum. If you drain this into the storm, drain, It goes straight into the ground, into the water table, into local streams. You could be looking at a massive environmental violation. The EPA, the State Environmental Agency, they take this very, very seriously. The EPA. The word struck her like a physical blow. The simple act of cleaning her pool, now potentially a federal crime. Her eyes darted back to Brenda's fence. A federal crime. The implications were staggering. So what do I do? She whispered, her voice barely audible. First, do absolutely nothing. Do not try to clean it. Do not drain it. We need to contain it. I'm going to recommend you call the fire department's hazmat unit, or at the very least, report this to your local environmental protection office and your insurance company immediately. The fire department? For my pool? Disbelief warred with a growing sense of terror. Ms. Vance, this is a significant chemical spill, contained or not. It's no longer just a pool. It's a containment vessel for hazardous waste, and frankly, this looks intentional. Did you have any issues with anyone? Henderson's eyes drifted pointedly towards the fence. Eleanor swallowed hard. My neighbor, Brenda Jenkins. We've had disagreements. Well, I'm not saying anything, but this isn't an accident. This is sabotage, and expensive sabotage, at that. Cleaning this up, you're looking at a specialized hazardous waste removal company. They have to vacuum it out, treat the water, deep clean all surfaces, potentially replace components. We're talking tens of thousands easily, possibly more depending on how much seeped in. Tens of thousands. Her meticulously planned retirement, fund, her peaceful existence, threatened by a neighbor's petty spite. The idea was unthinkable. After Henderson left, leaving behind a chilling estimate of the damage and a strong recommendation to call the authorities, Eleanor stood frozen. The sheer audacity, the malice of it, infuriated her more than the financial burden. She pictured Brenda, her tight-lipped smile, the glint of satisfaction in her eyes. It was always about winning with Brenda, no matter the cost. But this time, the stakes were too high. She called the local police department. The officer who arrived, a young man named Officer Miller, looked overwhelmed by the scene. He took notes, asked probing questions about her relationship with Brenda, but largely deferred to the environmental aspect. Ms. Vance, I've seen some crazy neighbor disputes, but this is beyond typical vandalism. Mr. Henderson is right. This isn't just property damage. This is an environmental incident. I'll file a report, but you really need to contact the State Department of Environmental Quality, maybe even the federal EPA directly. They have the jurisdiction for this kind of thing, and the penalties for mishandling hazardous materials can be severe even for the victim if they try to clean it up improperly. But I'm the victim, Eleanor protested, her voice rising in frustration. Someone did this to me. I understand that, ma'am, Officer Miller said patiently, though his eyes held a hint of weary resignation. But the law doesn't care who caused the spill when it comes to containing it and preventing further damage. The owner of the property where the spill occurred is ultimately responsible for cleanup. That's how it works with hazardous waste. We'll investigate the vandalism aspect, but the environmental cleanup is a separate and, frankly, much bigger issue. His words were a cold shower, dousing her hope for a simple resolution. She was responsible for Brenda's crime. The injustice burned. Later that afternoon, Eleanor found herself on hold with the State Department of Environmental Quality, DEQ. The music was tinny, irritating, doing nothing to soothe her frayed nerves. When a woman finally answered, her voice was clipped and professional. Eleanor explained the situation, trying to keep her tone calm, factual. My pool has been contaminated with a large amount of what appears to be motor oil. My pool technician said it's a hazardous spill and advised me to contact you. And you suspect a neighbor, Ms. Vance? The woman, who identified herself as Agent Davies, asked, her tone neutral. Yes, there's a history. And it's deliberate. No way this was an accident. Understood. We'll open a preliminary inquiry. However, I must inform you that under state and federal law, the responsible party for containing and remediating a hazardous substance release is the property owner. You are required to take immediate steps to prevent the spread of the contaminant. Have you contacted a licensed hazardous waste remediation company? Eleanor felt a wave of nausea. I've spoken to my pool company. They gave me an initial estimate. It's astronomical. Estimates often are for these types of incidents. We will need you to provide documentation of your efforts to secure the site and engage a qualified cleanup crew. Failure to do so could result in fines, significant fines. And if the oil migrates off your property into storm drains or the water table, the penalties increase exponentially. You could be facing civil penalties in the tens of thousands, and if negligence is found, criminal charges. Negligence? But I didn't do this, Eleanor cried out, tears stinging her eyes. I understand your distress, Ms. Vance, but from an environmental regulatory standpoint, you are the responsible party until another party is legally proven to be liable for the initial discharge. Our priority is public safety and environmental protection. We will send an inspector out within 48 hours. Do not touch the oil. Do not try to drain the pool. Do you understand? Eleanor hung up, her hand shaking. She was trapped by Brenda's malice, trapped by bureaucratic regulations, trapped by an environmental disaster she hadn't caused. The sheer scale of the problem was suffocating. She walked out to the patio again, standing before the polluted water. The sun was setting, casting long. The two EPA agents, Miller and Chen, moved with an unsettling efficiency that contrasted sharply with Eleanor's dazed state. They donned protective gloves and boots, their movements deliberate, as if Eleanor's pristine patio were a crime scene, which, she realized with a jolt, it effectively was. Agent Chen, younger and more methodical, began taking photographs from various angles, her camera clicking with unnerving regularity. Agent Miller, lean and with eyes that seemed to miss nothing, began asking questions, his voice a low hum against the rising tension in the air. Ms. Vance, can you describe in detail when you first discovered the release? He asked, his gaze sweeping over the iridescent slick on the pool's surface. Eleanor recounted the morning, her voice thin and reedy. She described the shock, the smell, the immediate horrifying realization. She pointed to the fence, to the subtle smear she had found on the lower rung. It has to be my neighbor, Brenda Jenkins, she stated, her conviction hardening with each word. We've had issues. She's vindictive. Agent Miller listened impassively, jotting notes on his clipboard. While your suspicions are noted, Ms. Vance, our primary concern is the containment and remediation of the hazardous material. The source and intent will be part of a separate investigation, but the immediate responsibility for cleanup falls to the property owner. Have you contacted a qualified hazardous waste cleanup contractor? I haven't had a chance to speak to any yet. I called my pool company yesterday and they confirmed it was a serious spill. They mentioned the EPA and DEQ, which is why I called the state agency. Eleanor felt a fresh wave of despair. It had only been a day, and already she was being treated as if she were the perpetrator. All right. We'll need contact information for any contractors you speak with. We'll also be taking samples of the oil and the water, Agent Miller said, gesturing to Agent Chen, who was already setting up a series of small, sterile vials and a long-handled scoop. These will be analyzed to determine the exact composition and potential origin. This might help us understand the type of oil used, which could be relevant to the ongoing investigation into the discharge event. Origin? Eleanor asked, a flicker of hope igniting. Could it trace back to her? It's possible, Ms. Vance. Different types of motor oil, for instance, have varying chemical signatures. However, that's a secondary concern to the immediate environmental threat. Miller's tone made it clear that her desire for justice was secondary to their mandate. They spent another hour in her backyard, meticulously collecting samples, measuring the oil's spread, and documenting every detail. Eleanor felt like an intruder in her own home, watching these strangers in their clinical gear move through her most private space, all because of Brenda's vicious act. After they finished their initial assessment, Agent Miller handed Eleanor a thick packet of documents. This outlines your obligations under CERCLA and other federal environmental statutes. It includes information on approved hazardous waste disposal facilities and certified cleanup contractors. You are required to submit a detailed remediation plan to our office within 72 hours, outlining how you intend to clean up this spill and prevent further environmental damage. Failure to comply or insufficient compliance will result in fines, escalating daily. But how am I supposed to afford this? Eleanor's voice was strained. My insurance company, I called them, but they said they need to investigate first to determine if it's covered under vandalism or a different clause. They said it could take weeks. That's an internal matter between you and your insurer, Ms. Vance, Agent. Chen interjected, her voice surprisingly soft, though her expression remained neutral. Our concern is the environmental hazard. The clock starts now. They left her with the overwhelming packet and a chilling sense of urgency. The financial burden was no longer abstract. It was a looming, inescapable monster. Eleanor spent the rest of the day in a frantic, desperate haze. She called every hazardous waste remediation company listed in the EPA packet that serviced her area. Each conversation was a variation of the last. Initial disbelief, followed by grim pronouncements of complexity and cost. The first estimate from Green Clean Environmental Services was for $75,000. $75,000 for her pool. It included containment booms, specialized vacuum trucks, chemical treatments, and the proper disposal of the oily water as hazardous waste. It didn't even include the cost of replacing her pool equipment. The second, from AquaGuard Remediation, was $90,000, citing additional concerns about potential seepage into the soil around the pool. The third, EcoSolve Solutions, quoted an initial assessment fee of $1,000, then estimated the total cost could range from $60,000 to $120,000 depending on the extent of the contamination in the filtration system. Eleanor felt lightheaded. Her meticulously managed savings, intended for her dignified retirement, for small comforts and peace of mind, were utterly inadequate for this catastrophe. Her modest insurance policy, while comprehensive for standard damage, had never anticipated an act of environmental malice on this scale. She called her insurance agent, a calm, reassuring man named Robert, who had handled her policy for years. His voice was sympathetic, but guarded. Eleanor, I've forwarded your claim to the Special Investigations Unit. A hazardous waste claim like this, especially one involving suspected vandalism, requires a thorough assessment. We need to send our own adjusters, environmental engineers, to verify the extent of the damage and confirm it aligns with the policy's terms. It's not as simple as a broken window. We're talking about environmental liability here. It could take a few weeks, possibly a month, before we can authorize anything. A month? Eleanor cried, her voice rising in panic. The EPA is giving me 72 hours to submit a remediation plan. They're threatening me with fines of hundreds of thousands of dollars per day if I don't comply. I don't have that kind of money, Robert. I understand, Eleanor, and I'm truly sorry. You're going through this. My best advice is to cooperate fully with the EPA. Document everything. Get those estimates. Show them you're making a good faith effort. That might mitigate the immediate penalties. We'll do everything we can on our end. But these things move slowly, slowly. The word echoed in her mind, a cruel counterpoint to the EPA's ticking clock. She was caught between a rock and a hard place, bleeding money she didn't have while waiting for an insurance company to decide if her neighbor's malicious act was covered. Desperate, Eleanor decided to take matters into her own hands, at least, in gathering more evidence. She knew Brenda had to have some large containers to carry that much oil. Later that evening, under the cover of dusk, she crept out to her backyard. She peered over the fence, careful not to be seen. Brenda's yard was typically cluttered, but tonight it seemed even more so. There was a stack of old tires, a broken lawnmower, and a general disarray that made Eleanor's meticulously kept yard seem even more stark in contrast. Her eyes scanned for anything that could have held gallons of oil. Old paint cans? No, too small. A large trash bin? Possible. But it would be hard to dump that over the fence without leaving more obvious traces. Then she saw it. Tucked behind a large, overgrown bush near the back of Brenda's property, almost. Hidden from view was a stack of 5-gallon plastic buckets. They were the kind used for industrial cleaners or chemicals, sturdy and with thick handles. 3 of them, stacked haphazardly. And on the side of one, barely visible in the fading light, was a dark, greasy stain. It was the same dark, viscous substance that coated her pool. Her heart pounded. This was it. This was the proof. Eleanor quickly snapped a few photos with her phone, zooming in on the stain as best she could in the dim light. She knew it wasn't definitive, but it was something. It was circumstantial, but it screamed guilty. The next morning, armed with shaky phone photos and renewed resolve, Eleanor decided to try a different approach. She had called the police, the state environmental agency, and the federal EPA. Now she would go to the source. She would confront Brenda. She walked purposefully to Brenda's front door and rang the doorbell, her heart thumping against her ribs. She had rehearsed what, she would say, a delicate balance of accusation and demand for restitution. Brenda opened the door, her eyes wide with feigned surprise. She was wearing a faded housecoat, her hair in disarray. Eleanor? Well, isn't this a surprise? To what do I owe the pleasure? Brenda's voice was dripping with false sweetness. You know why I'm here, Brenda, Eleanor said, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts to control it. My pool, the oil. It was you, wasn't it? Brenda's eyes narrowed, her smile vanishing. Are you accusing me of something? Eleanor? That's a serious accusation. I found the buckets, Brenda, behind your bush, with the oil stains. Eleanor held up her phone, displaying the blurry photos. The EPA is involved now. They're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines for my property because of what you did. Brenda laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. Buckets? Oil stains? Eleanor, I work on my car sometimes. I have old buckets. This is ridiculous. You think I'd be stupid enough to dump oil in your pool? What proof do you have? Just some blurry photos of my own buckets? She paused, her eyes glinting, with malicious triumph. And the EPA? Oh, that's rich. Sounds like your problem, not. Eleanor woke with a jolt, the chilling memory of Brenda's insinuations still echoing in her mind. Maybe you did it yourself, for the insurance money. The words were a poison, designed to undermine her and sow doubt. She couldn't let it stand. The blurred photos of the oil-stained buckets weren't enough. She needed something concrete, something undeniable. Her gaze fell on her old digital camera, lying on the dresser. It was a bulky, outdated model, but its lens was far superior to her phone's for capturing detail. She needed a clear shot of those buckets, a high-resolution image that would show the distinct pattern of the oil, perhaps even a brand name on the containers if she was lucky. More importantly, she needed a way to link Brenda directly to the act. The idea that formed in her mind was audacious, bordering on reckless. She would need to get into Brenda's yard, not just peek over the fence, but actually enter. The thought made her stomach churn, but desperation was a powerful motivator. The EPA deadline was ticking, and the threat of financial ruin loomed larger with every passing hour. She waited until dusk, just as the streetlights began to hum to life. Brenda usually left her house around this time to walk her dog, a yappy terrier named Sparky, whose schedule was surprisingly predictable. Eleanor dressed in dark clothing, her old camera clutched tightly in her hand. She felt ridiculous, like a character in a bad spy movie, but the gravity of her situation overshadowed any self-consciousness. The gate separating their properties was old and creaky, secured only by a rusty latch. Eleanor carefully unhooked it, wincing at the faint squeal of metal. She slipped through, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Brenda's backyard was a chaotic landscape of neglect. Overgrown weeds, rusty garden tools, and scattered junk. The air hung heavy with the smell of damp earth and something vaguely metallic. Eleanor moved silently, her eyes darting around. She found the bush, larger and denser than it appeared from her side of the fence. Crouching low, she pushed aside the prickly branches. There they were, the 3 5-gallon plastic buckets, still stacked, their dark stains almost invisible. In the encroaching gloom, she pulled out her camera, fumbling with the settings. The flash would give her away. She needed to use the available light. She held her breath, steadying her hands, and began to take multiple shots, zooming in on the stains, on the worn plastic of the buckets, trying to capture any identifying marks. She snapped a picture of the overall stack, then individual close-ups. As she was engrossed in her task, a faint glint caught her eye. On the ground, partially obscured by a weed, was a small, dark object. She reached for it, her fingers brushing against something smooth and cool. It was a key card, the kind used for access to commercial properties or apartment buildings. It was thin, black, and had a small, almost faded logo on it, Auto Pro Wholesale Parts and Supplies. Eleanor's breath hitched. Auto Pro. A wholesale auto parts supplier. A place where someone could easily purchase large quantities of engine oil without raising suspicion. And a keycard would mean Brenda had an account, or at least regular access. This was it. This was the irrefutable link. She carefully slipped the keycard into her pocket, her mind racing. This wasn't just circumstantial evidence anymore. This was physical proof of intent and source. She quickly finished taking photos, her movements more urgent now, fueled by a surge of desperate hope. Just as she was about to turn and slip back, through the gate, she heard it. The familiar, high-pitched yapping of Sparky, rapidly approaching. Brenda. Her heart leaped into her throat. She froze, crouching deeper into the bush, praying Brenda wouldn't look in her direction. The yapping grew louder, closer, then stopped abruptly. Eleanor heard Brenda's voice, sharp and annoyed. "Sparky! What is it, boy? What do you smell?" Panic flared. Sparky was known for sniffing out anything unusual. Eleanor held her breath, her muscles tensed. She heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving closer to the bush. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to run, but she knew that would confirm her presence. Then, Brenda's voice, directly on the other side of the bush. "It's just a squirrel, you silly dog. Come on, let's go." Eleanor heard the distinct rustle of leaves as Brenda pulled Sparky away. The footsteps receded, the yapping slowly fading into the distance. Eleanor stayed hidden for another minute, her body shaking before finally pushing herself up. She slipped through the gate, latching it as silently as possible, and sprinted back to her house, her hands clammy, her camera and the keycard clutched like precious artifacts. Safe inside, Eleanor collapsed onto her couch, adrenaline still coursing through her veins. She uploaded the photos to her computer. Even in the dim light, the oil stains on the buckets were clear, and then she held up the keycard. Auto Pro Wholesale Parts and Supplies. This was the smoking gun. The next morning, Eleanor called Agent Miller directly. Her voice, though still strained, held a new note of confidence. "Agent Miller, I have new evidence regarding the oil spill. I believe it strongly implicates my neighbor, Brenda Jenkins." There was a skeptical pause on the other end. "Ms. Vance, we appreciate any information, but as we discussed, we are primarily focused on the environmental remediation. You have less than 24 hours left to submit your plan. This isn't just speculation, Agent. I have photos of oil-stained buckets in her yard, identical to the oil in my pool. And I found this. Eleanor described the key card, its logo, and the implications. This isn't just vandalism. This is a deliberate, targeted act. And now I have proof of where she likely obtained the material. Agent Miller's tone shifted, a flicker of professional interest replacing his previous detachment. A key card from a wholesale parts supplier? That's certainly more compelling than the vague suspicions you offered previously. Can you bring the key card and the photos to our field office? Immediately, Eleanor agreed, feeling a glimmer of vindication. She dressed quickly, took the key card and a flash drive containing the high-resolution photos, and drove to the EPA field office. The waiting room was sterile and unwelcoming, but Eleanor felt a surge of purpose. This was it. This was her chance. She was ushered into a small, windowless interrogation room. Agent Miller and Agent Chen were waiting. Eleanor laid the key card on the table. Agent Miller picked it up, turning it over in his fingers, his expression unreadable. Agent Chen inserted the flash drive into a laptop and began reviewing the photos. These buckets, the stains are quite distinct, Agent Chen murmured, zooming in on one of Eleanor's shots. And the key card. This is from a commercial account, not something a casual customer would have. This indicates regular or bulk purchases. Agent Miller nodded slowly. Ms. Vance, this is significant. This provides a direct lead to the source and a strong circumstantial link to Ms. Jenkins. However, we still need to establish direct causation. We can't just go knocking on her door based on this alone. We'll need to subpoena records from Auto Pro, cross-reference purchase history with Ms. Jenkins, and ideally find some direct evidence linking her to the act of dumping. Eleanor's heart sank. Subpoena? How long will that take? The 72-hour deadline is almost up. I still don't have a remediation plan or the money. Agent Miller leaned forward, his voice softer, but no less firm. Ms. Vance, we understand your predicament. Your cooperation in identifying a potentially responsible party is helpful. It won't, however, absolve you of your primary responsibility, to contain and clean up the spill on your property. We can issue an administrative order to compel action, which carries even steeper penalties if not obeyed. My advice stands. Get a cleanup contractor on board. Show us you're making progress. The door opened, and a third agent, an older man with a severe expression, walked in. Miller Chen, what do we have here? Director Hayes, this is Ms. Eleanor Vance. She's the property owner where the large petroleum spill occurred. She's provided some new information regarding a possible responsible party, a neighbor, Ms. Brenda Jenkins. Agent Miller briefly explained the buckets and the key card. Director Hayes picked up the key card, his eyes narrowing as he examined it. Auto Pro, interesting. We've had dealings with them before regarding proper disposal of waste oils from their commercial clients. Nothing major, but they're on our radar. Ms. Vance, while this key card provides a strong lead, it is not direct proof of Ms. Jenkins's involvement in this specific discharge. Did anyone see her dump the oil? Eleanor shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. No, I was asleep, but it has to be her. No one else. And she threatened me, Director. She said I did it myself for the insurance money. Director Hayes's expression hardened. An accusation of fraud. That complicates matters further. Look, Ms. Vance, we will pursue this lead. We will subpoena AutoPro's records. We will conduct surveillance on Ms. Jenkins if necessary, but you need to understand, this takes time. Legal processes are slow. In the meantime, the environmental clock is ticking. You are still facing significant penalties for non-compliance with the cleanup order. He stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. My recommendation, take out a loan. Max out your credit cards if you have to. Get the cleanup started. Once we establish Ms. Jenkins's culpability, we can pursue her for cost recovery. But until then, the burden is on you. If you fail to comply, Ms. Vance, We will have no choice but to levy those daily fines and potentially even pursue legal action." The weight of Director Hayes's words settled on Eleanor like a physical burden. Seize assets. Her home, her sanctuary, now jeopardized by a neighbor's malice and the cold, unfeeling hand of bureaucracy. There was no choice. The cleanup had to begin. With a heavy heart, Eleanor called Green Clean Environmental Services, the company that had quoted her the lowest estimate of $75,000. The sales representative, Mr. Donovan, was empathetic but firm. "Ms. Vance, we can mobilize our crew within 24 hours, but we require a signed contract and a substantial deposit up front. This isn't like cleaning a clogged drain. It involves specialized equipment, highly trained personnel, and strict adherence to hazardous waste disposal regulations." Eleanor felt a wave of nausea. "A deposit? How much?" "Typically, 50% for a project of this scale, Ms. Vance. $37,500. The balance upon completion. $37,500. It was more than half of her emergency fund. Money she had diligently saved over decades, the buffer against unexpected medical costs, the cushion for her retirement. Now it would vanish into the oily abyss of her pool. She swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. I'll send the transfer. Immediately." The next day, Eleanor's backyard transformed into a scene of organized chaos. A large tanker truck rumbled onto her street, followed by several utility vans. Men in full protective gear, white hazmat suits, respirators, and heavy gloves, swarmed her property. They deployed thick, buoyant booms across the pool's surface, designed to contain the oil and prevent it from adhering further to the tiles. Specialized vacuum hoses, thick as fire hoses, snaked across her patio, sucking the oily water into the tanker. The air filled with the whirring of pumps and the acrid smell of the oil, now concentrated and even more potent. Eleanor watched from her kitchen window, a strange mix of relief and despair churning within her. Relief that something was finally being done, despair at the sheer cost and the violation of her privacy. Each whir of the pump was a drumbeat counting down her savings, each hazmat-suited figure a grim reminder of her neighbor's destructive act. Over the next few days, the cleanup continued relentlessly. The initial oil removal was followed by multiple rinses and chemical treatments designed to break down residual film. Every inch of the pool's surface, from the tiles to the coping, was scrubbed by hand. The filter system, the pump, the intricate network of pipes, all had to be flushed, chemically cleaned, and in some cases, partially disassembled for deep decontamination. Mr. Donovan presented her with an itemized list of expenses, explaining each step in excruciating detail. The original $75,000 felt like a bargain compared to the mounting tally of unforeseen complications. The filters, saturated with oil, needed replacing. Some sections of piping showed signs of corrosion from prolonged oil exposure. The costs crept higher, reaching into the low six figures. "This is an extensive job, Ms. Vance," Mr. Donovan explained patiently. "The oil permeated deeper than we initially estimated. We have to ensure every trace is removed, or you'll face further regulatory issues and potential long-term damage to your pool structure." Eleanor nodded numbly, signing off on additional charges, her checking account balance dwindling with each stroke of the pen. She felt like she was bleeding money, watching her financial security drain away with the polluted water. Meanwhile, Brenda remained oblivious, or at least appeared to be. Eleanor would sometimes see her through the kitchen window tending to her neglected garden or walking Sparky, her expression serene, almost smug. It infuriated Eleanor. Brenda hadn't faced a single consequence, while Eleanor was being financially decimated. A week later, Eleanor received a call from Agent Chen. "Ms. Vance, we've made progress on the Auto Pro keycard. We issued a subpoena for their records, and they've complied. The keycard you found belongs to a commercial account registered to Brenda's Home and Auto Services, a small unregistered business operating out of Ms. Jenkins's home address. The account shows significant purchases of bulk motor oil, industrial-grade, 55-gallon drums, over the past 6 months. Eleanor's heart leaped. See? I knew it. That's her. She runs some sort of small repair business from her home, though I never knew she purchased in that quantity. It's compelling, Ms. Vance. It certainly establishes a means and a motive for possession. However, it's still not direct evidence of her dumping the oil into your pool. We've also cross-referenced with local trash collection services. But there's no record of specialized waste disposal from her address that would account for the volume of oil she purchased. This suggests improper disposal, which is another violation, but doesn't definitively link her to your pool. So, what's next? Eleanor asked, her voice tinged with a desperate edge. We're escalating. Director Hayes has authorized surveillance. We'll be discreetly monitoring Ms. Jenkins's property for any activity related to hazardous waste disposal, or frankly, anything else suspicious. We're also sending a forensics team to your pool area tomorrow morning to take more detailed samples, focusing on trace evidence that might indicate how the oil was transferred. Eleanor felt a cautious flicker of hope. Surveillance, forensics. This was serious. This was the EPA finally taking Brenda seriously. The next morning, 2 new EPA agents dressed in crisp jumpsuits arrived with a portable lab. They meticulously scraped the edges of the pool coping, tested the wooden fence for residue, and even took soil samples from the area immediately adjacent to the fence line. One of them, a woman with keen eyes, spent a long time examining the ground directly beneath Brenda's fence, shining a UV light. What are you looking for? Eleanor asked, trying not to get in their way. Trace evidence, Ms. Vance. Microscopic fibers, soil disruption, anything that might link a specific action to this spot. And with UV light, sometimes you can detect invisible residues, the agent explained, not looking up. Later that afternoon, Eleanor saw it. A plain, unmarked van parked down the street from Brenda's house. The windows were tinted, and it stayed there, motionless, day and night. The EPA had begun its surveillance. A grim satisfaction spread through Eleanor. Brenda might be smug now, but she was being watched. The pool cleanup concluded 5 days later. The water, after multiple filtration cycles and chemical balancing, was finally pristine again, shimmering under the sun as if no catastrophe had ever stained its depths. But Eleanor knew the cost. The final bill from Green Clean Environmental Services was an astronomical $108,000. Her savings account was practically empty. She had drained her retirement fund, sold a small portfolio of stocks she had held for years, and even considered taking out a second mortgage on her house, only stopping short when her financial advisor warned her it was an act of last resort. She was financially devastated, but her pool was clean. For now, the EPA was satisfied. But Brenda had yet to pay. A week passed. Eleanor was consumed by the stark reality of her financial situation, trying to figure out how she would manage her future with her savings gone. Then a thick envelope arrived from the EPA. Inside was a formal legal document, an administrative order demanding immediate and sustained compliance with all environmental regulations related to the spill, outlining the penalties for non-compliance, and stating that the EPA reserved the right to pursue cost recovery from all identified responsible parties. Buried deep within the document, Eleanor found a single chilling paragraph highlighted in bold. Further, the ongoing investigation has yielded sufficient preliminary evidence to designate Ms. Brenda Jenkins, residing at Brenda's address, as a potentially responsible party, PRP, in connection with the aforementioned hazardous substance release. The agency is hereby initiating formal administrative enforcement actions against Ms. Jenkins, including but not limited to the issuance of a request for information and a notice of potential liability under Section 104 and 107 of CERCLA. This designation means that Ms. Jenkins may be held jointly and severally liable for all costs associated with the investigation, response action, and remediation of the release at Eleanor's address, including, but not limited to, all costs incurred by Ms. Eleanor Vance in good faith compliance with agency directives. Eleanor read the words again, her breath catching in her throat. Potentially responsible party, jointly and severally liable. All costs. A slow, triumphant smile spread across her face. It was happening. It was finally happening. Brenda was about to receive her own, much larger bill. The official notice from the EPA, crisp and unyielding, landed on Brenda Jenkins's doorstep like a harbinger of doom. Eleanor didn't witness Brenda receiving it, but the sudden cessation of Brenda's usual backyard activities, the blinds drawn tight, the silence from next door, where there was usually some clatter, told Eleanor all she needed to know. The EPA's heavy hand had finally descended. A week later, Eleanor received a call from Agent Miller. His voice was no longer detached. It carried a note of professional satisfaction. "Ms. Vance, we've served Ms. Jenkins with the notice of potential liability. She attempted to deny everything, of course, but the evidence we've compiled is substantial. The Auto Pro records, the forensic analysis of the oil traces, and particularly the soil samples from beneath your shared fence." Eleanor leaned forward, her heart pounding. "The soil samples? What did they show?" "We found significant concentrations of the same specific motor oil composition in the soil directly under the fence on her side, consistent with a large volume spill and residue on the bottom of the fence itself. It appears she likely rested the buckets there, or perhaps even poured some of the oil onto the ground during the transfer. This, combined with the purchase history and the circumstantial evidence of her key card, forms a very strong case for her culpability as the sole responsible party for the discharge." A wave of profound relief, sharp and sweet, washed over Eleanor. It was more than just a theory now. It was scientific fact. "So she's responsible?" "Legally, yes. Under CERCLA, once a party is designated as a PRP and liability is established, they are held strictly liable. This means intent isn't the primary factor for cleanup costs, only that they cause the release. We also have a very clear pattern of non-compliance with proper waste disposal for the bulk oil she was purchasing, which further strengthens our case for penalties. Director Hayes is moving forward with a formal demand for reimbursement for your cleanup costs and significant civil penalties from her directly." "How much are we talking about?" Eleanor asked, almost afraid to voice the question. "Well, Ms. Vance, first, the EPA will seek full cost recovery for all remediation expenses you incurred. That $108,000 you spent? Brenda Jenkins will be legally obligated to reimburse you for every cent, plus interest and any additional administrative fees. Beyond that, the EPA is assessing civil penalties for the unauthorized discharge of hazardous waste and the improper disposal of the bulk oil purchased from Auto Pro. Given the volume, the deliberate nature of the act, and the environmental impact, the initial assessment for fines alone is significant. We're looking at a penalty in the range of $300,000 to $400,000, which could be higher depending on the outcome of further legal proceedings or if we find additional violations." Eleanor gasped. $300,000 to $400,000 in fines, plus her $108,000. $500,000. The title of her story, the impossible number she'd imagined in her darkest moments, was becoming terrifyingly real for Brenda. Justice, it seemed, was not only blind but also astronomically expensive. Days later, the full weight of the EPA's action became devastatingly clear. A letter arrived for Eleanor, formal and official, confirming Brenda Jenkins's designation as the sole potentially responsible party, and outlining the agency's intent to pursue $108,000 in cost recovery on Eleanor's behalf, along with an initial demand for $390,000 in civil penalties from Brenda for violations of the Clean Water Act and CERCLA. The grand total for Brenda was $498,000. Eleanor held the letter, her hand trembling. It was almost exactly $500,000 for pouring oil into a pool. The irony was suffocating. Brenda had inflicted financial ruin on Eleanor, only to be utterly crushed by the very system Eleanor had turned to for help. Brenda, predictably, fought back. She hired a lawyer, a sharp-suited man who initially tried to dismiss the EPA's claims as baseless. But the EPA didn't bluff. They presented their meticulously gathered evidence, the forensic analysis, the subpoenaed records from Auto Pro, the surveillance logs, even the faint UV light traces on the fence. The case against Brenda was ironclad. The legal battle dragged on for months, a slow, grueling process that chipped away at Brenda's stubborn defiance. Eleanor, though still recovering financially, found a renewed sense of peace as she watched Brenda's world unravel. The unmarked surveillance van eventually disappeared, replaced by the occasional official car, then the appearance of real estate signs in Brenda's yard. Brenda's home, the source of so much petty animosity, went up for sale. Then came the whispers from other neighbors. Brenda had been forced to declare bankruptcy. Her small, unregistered home and auto services business, which she had evidently been running for years with improper waste disposal practices, was exposed and shut down. The EPA, unyielding in its pursuit of environmental compliance, had levied penalties that far exceeded her assets. She couldn't afford the fines, let alone reimburse Eleanor. The house was her only significant asset, and it wasn't enough. One morning, Eleanor heard the distinct sounds of a moving truck next door. She peeked through her kitchen window. Brenda, looking gaunt and defeated, was supervising the loading of a few meager boxes into a small U-Haul. Her face, usually a mask of smugness or irritation, was now etched with a profound despair Eleanor had never thought to see there. Sparky, usually yapping incessantly, was held close in Brenda's arms, silent. Brenda paused, her eyes sweeping over her overgrown yard, then drifting, almost reluctantly, to Eleanor's pristine pool. It shimmered in the morning sun, a clear, untroubled blue. Their eyes met across the green expanse, a silent, charged moment. There was no anger, no triumph from Eleanor, just a quiet, profound understanding of the immense, devastating consequences of a malicious act. Brenda's gaze held a flicker of something unreadable. Perhaps regret, perhaps just the cold, hard shock of a world turned upside down by her own hand. Then, she turned away. Her shoulders slumped, and stepped into the U-Haul. The truck rumbled away, leaving Brenda's house empty and echoing, a stark monument to a $500,000 lesson. Eleanor stood by her sparkling pool, a gentle breeze ruffling the surface. The oil was gone. The financial burden remained, but it was now a shared burden, shifted squarely onto the shoulders of the one who truly deserved it. Justice, often slow, had finally arrived, delivered not by human hand, but by the relentless, unyielding force of environmental law. And the peace in her backyard, once shattered, was slowly, finally returning.